So my point was going to be that actually belief in something like an afterlife is it's consistent, at least, with the hypothesis that evolution is extending the possible, if gratification can be delayed till after death, right? That in effect, by building an afterlife on which you reflect during your actual life, one can effectively reschedule the rewards such that it is fine by you to pay a cost that you are not repaid in life, thinking that it will be repaid later. And in some sense, it is repaid, but not in the form that the mythology would tell us. It's repaid in the form of your descendants, the carriers of your genes, being well positioned in their future going forward. And so
see, it's ideas like that motivated, at least in part, the discussions that I had with Sam Harris, because that's a really good example, assuming that it's valid, and it might be, and it might not be, like we can't tell. That's an idea. Let's say your proposition is that's an idea that in some sense is objectively false, but evolutionarily true.
Metaphorically true, but literally false.
Yep. Yes, but because it furthers adaptation, and it's at some point it's difficult to. At some point, you have to make it's difficult to draw a distinction between truth as it's defined pragmatically and on the Darwinian landscape, and truth as it's defined when your concern is the nature of the objective world. And that was really at the core of the discussion that I wanted to continually have with Sam, and I think did have with some degree of success.
So I agree with what you just said, and the difficult point. Sometimes I can make this point to the scientifically minded about the phenomenon of religious mythology. It becomes very difficult to make the reverse point, which I heard you just make there, which is actually, if you look at the way we do science, effectively we start out with a large fraction of a model that we have for some phenomenon, and the large fraction is effectively metaphorically true, literally false. It's good enough in order to operate in the space, but it's not accurate if you pursue the phenomenology. And over time, what you get is models that contain less and less of that metaphorical truth and are closer and closer to literal laboratory truth. You never get to zero, right, as far as we know. But the fact that we get better causes us not to realize that it was in some sense an analog of the instinct to religious faith that effectively provides the faith to explore.
Yeah, that was exactly Jung's argument about the derivation of science from alchemy.
Interesting.
Well, it's exactly that argument, is that from the Jungian perspective, the alchemists were possessed by and the fantasy was that the redemptive substance could be found in the bowels of matter, in base matter, and the perfection of matter would reveal the redemptive substance. And now the reason that Jung insisted upon that was because he was trying to account for why people became motivated to pursue the painstaking behaviors and observations that made up empirical science, which may not be motivationally significant in and of themselves. They have to be associated with something that is of motivational significance. So it was a redemptive fantasy. And that's also partly what convinced me that the scientific enterprise is in some sense ineradicably nested inside a narrative. And the narrative is, well, if we explore the material world, the objective material world, that will be of benefit to all of us. And that's not a scientific proposition. That's an a priori statement of faith that motivates everything that constitutes the scientific enterprise. And so that's another example of the same thing. I don't know where else we can turn for answers. I also turned to the past. I made the presupposition, which is something you laid out earlier, that if an animal species engages in a behavior consistently, you might start by assuming that there's something useful about it, even though you might not understand it. I made that assumption when I was looking at religious belief, because it was clear to me, and still is, as a biologist, that human beings have a religious instinct. We have the capacity for religious experience. And so that it so dismissing all that out of hand because you're scientific actually seems to me to be a contradiction in terms. If you're a physicist, perhaps, and perhaps not, but if you're a biologist, well, no, wait a minute. You run into the problem of Darwin immediately. Human beings have a religious instinct. Why is that? Well, is it a spandrel? I don't think you should be allowed to define spandrels post hoc. I can't figure out why that's useful. Therefore, it's an evolutionary dead end. Perhaps not.
Well, the Spandrel argument, it's funny. I was just writing about it a little bit this morning. But the Spandrel argument is a red herring. Your argument is exactly correct. And in fact, I generated a 4-part test for adaptation to escape the Spandrels argument many years ago. Back when
do you want to define spandrel just so that we don't lose people on that word?
Sure. Yeah, spandrel is an architectural consequence of placing a dome on columns. There are these sort of roughly triangular shapes, and there's a famous set of them in St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, which Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin used as the central metaphor in a paper that they wrote in 1979, which argued that evolutionary biologists were getting ahead of themselves and making up lots of stories to explain why this, that, and the other trait of creatures was adaptive, when in fact they didn't have the logical basis to make that claim. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole set of counter arguments, but it's a nonsense argument on their part. There's like a grain of truth and then a whole lot of fiction stacked on top of it, which was interestingly deployed. Both Gould and Lewontin had Marxist sympathies, and there was this sense that, so this was the era in which sociobiology was taking off, and people were realizing just how powerful evolutionary thinking was in explaining human behavior. And Marxists don't like this idea at all. They fear it because...
Well, it means that human beings aren't infinitely malleable,
or
that we have a nature, and that has to be contended with.
That we have a nature and that we are not inherently equal, right? Because in order for this to be a consequence, in order for behavior to be a consequence of evolution, more effective behaviors had to outcompete less effective behaviors. More effective people had to outcompete less effective people. And so it runs counter to the Marxist sympathies. And so in effect, this paper, based on these spandrels, argued that evolutionists didn't have the evidence to claim adaptation except very rarely. So the idea
because
was,
a phenomenon could be the side effect of something that was selected for, and it hadn't been selected against yet, so it's there, but it's not because it evolved, so to speak.
Right. So if you were standing looking at, and maybe I took some pictures when I was in Venice recently, and I took some pictures of these spandrels for the purpose of talking about them on YouTube. And anyway, so these triangular spaces that are left when you place this dome on top of these columns have been filled with mosaics. In the central one, they've been filled with mosaics of the 4 evangelists. And so their point was, you could look at these and you could say that the purpose of the spandrel is to house these mosaics, when in fact the spandrel is an accident and the mosaics are just something that opportunistically was placed there. So why did that come up here? We were talking about... you were talking about religion and whether or not it was justified to imagine that it was serving some adaptive purpose by virtue of the fact that human beings seem to have a propensity for religious belief. And I 100% agree with this argument. I have made this argument myself. The cost of religion to humans is so great that it must be paying that and much more, at least historically, in order for it to have been a feature of every important civilization. So that argument is completely robust as far as I'm concerned.